Charlotte Fairbairn, Lowther's creative director, who's been working there for almost 10 years. Born in Scotland, now an adopted Cumbrian through and through. Friends of the Daleswater Way has a sort of relationship with Lowther. If you look at the yellow board over there, we were one of 6 NGOs that profited from an amazing event hosted by Lowther. Some of you will have been there, the 10,000 Daffodils event, which was an extraordinary success story, put on with the great generosity of Lowther. We also have a link through a loop, the so-called Lowther Loop. When we started with Friends of Daleswater Way in 2016, there was just a walk around the lake. And then we added on a loop to Lowther, a loop to Dale Main, and recently in April this year, a Wordsworth, not really a loop, but a direct line to Ambleside in honor of Wordsworth. And we're still thinking through ways in which we can expand the networking of these different paths. We find them so inspirational that through walking and understanding the countryside and nature and landscape and the people who live there, we all are better for it. Coming back to Charlotte, she's a lady of many talents and interests. You've authored 7 books, or is it more?
Depends if you count guidebooks.
Yes, we count guidebooks.
A few more than.
But 7 books is not a bad record. She's a horse lover, dog lover, bird lover, wildlife lover, Cumbria lover, wine lover, and book lover. And she's particularly the co-founder of the Lake District Book Festival, which I believe she's planning for next year at Cartmel in June. She seems to ooze a passion for arts and literature and creativity from every pore. I think she's going to take us on an amazing journey through the history of Lowther, from its rather humble origins a millennium ago to its rise in glory, and then its sad demise, and now it's going through a rebirth and a restoration. And I think it's a huge personal and institutional challenge for Lowther to be there at such a key role in its history and to play, and I'm sure you are, a major part in the rewriting of the new history of Lowther. Without more ado, I think I'm going to pass the floor to you. Welcome, Charlotte, and we wish you the best of luck on your adventure tonight.
Thank you. Yes, I am Charlotte. It's very nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, and I do write books and I do other things, but I've been at Lowther as my kind of role as the creative director. Started very humbly, and I was a bit wet behind the ears, as we all were at that time. And then it sort of grown to, I wrote the first story of Lowther exhibition. So I spent a lot of time in the archive at Carlisle and in Dr. Owen's book, The Lowther Family. And then my role has gradually grown. So if you visit Lowther, which I imagine quite a few of you do, anything that isn't a flower or a stone, anything that has writing on it, that's probably me. Anyway, so this is of necessity going to be quite condensed because there's quite a lot of history to cover, but I'm going to see if I can touch on some things of interest, and hopefully those who know about Lowther will find out something they didn't know. Do I point it to this? Yeah. Okay, so in the old days, when I first wrote the first exhibition, and I referred to Hugh Owen's book, I always thought that Lowther, and I'm talking about the estate and the dynasty in the same breath, that they originated with a Christianized Viking from Yorkshire called Lowther. And the evidence for the fact that Lowther was a Viking rested in these rather amazing hogback stones that were uncovered in the churchyard at St Michael's, Lowther, in the late 19th century. These were thought to be tombstones, and because they are big, I mean, the largest one, that's both sides of the smaller one, the largest one's probably about 9 foot long. And because they're ornately carved, they're obviously done for people of standing, and they were thought to depict the scenes from the life of the people who were buried underneath them. However, the reason I said the old days is because recently, and I don't know if anyone saw Digging for Britain View a couple of years ago, so the University of Lancaster under Sophie Ambler, who's a reader in medieval history, and UCLan began an archaeological dig in the woods in the North Park. It was thought that the first Lowther dwelling was a motte and bailey, and the tumulus in the woods was the thing that they were investigating in the first year. And so those fingernails belong to Alice Roberts, and she's the woman who presents, you probably know her with pink hair, who presents Digging for Britain if you watch it. And that was a drawing that she did of what they believe was under the tumulus. And when they'd done the dig, they did a channel, they'd done LiDAR scans and whatever you do. They decided that what probably wasn't a motte and bailey per se. They believe it might have been an early Norman windwork castle, which changes one's perspective of who the early people at Lowther were. Another thing that's of interest in that drawing is that she has unimagined the trees around where the castle was. And you can see that Lowther the castle, as you know, sits on Night Scar, so on this amazing bluff that overlooks Lowther Valley and the Bampton Valley. That castle there, without the trees, you can see what a significant site it was, that it had a commanding view. So although they haven't conclusively concluded anything, they think that what they've uncovered here and with what they've seen at the medieval village, which is adjacent, is that the Normans did come to Lowther. They did come to Cumbria, rather, because as you probably know, Cumbria is not in the Domesday Book because William the Conqueror didn't make it. However, they believe, and they will conclusively conclude their conclusions at some point soon, they believe that this is evidence that the Normans under William Rufus did conquer Cumbria, and it therefore gives you a quite different perspective on British history. I'm not an academic, so and I'm not a historian per se, but so that's what that is unveiled. I'm sorry, pointing more on there. The other thing, and I don't know if anyone knows about these, I didn't particularly know about them, but at the same time as these archaeological findings were being made, a woman called Christina Carrott-Smith, an academic, who describes herself on her website as an old stone nerd, which I think what she means is she's a nerd about old stones. She did a report on what are known as the Lowther monumental sculptures, and there are 10 of these, and 8 of them are dotted around in the church, looking probably sad and neglected. That is the most significant. That is the Great Cross, the Lowther Cross. That's pictured in the Great Hall in the British Museum. I don't know whether it's still on display there. So her conclusions, as a kind of obviously a very hard-working stone nerd, is that the existence of these and the nature of these, they're very elaborate. They would have been required greatly skilled craftsmen to make them. She thinks that denotes that Lowther Church, which is also on its own bluff and which presumably would not have been surrounded by trees in the 8th, 9th and 10th centuries from when these date, was so that the whole of Lowther added together was a significant historical site and a significant religious site, and so all of which is kind of fascinating if you're interested in it, in old history. But anyway, in the new days, I have to rethink what I thought before, but I still think that dolphin probably still existed. The other thing to be said about how far the original Lowther person goes back, the original scion of the family, as it were, is that Sir Richard Lowther, who's the one who's got the lovely alabaster effigy in the church, he did a pedigree of all the Lowthers that have known to marry, all the people who have known to marry all the Lowthers. He did it with Shields. And he says in there that the first Lowther marriage was between a Lowther and a Danecourt, D''Aimcourt, in 949. So, and that was dolphin is thought to be later than that. So, I mean, it's all hazy because it's so long ago. But whatever, whether dolphin was the first Lowther, whether he was the sort of the beginning of the family and the dynasty and what have you, I think one of the true things that I used to believe, and I think I'm allowed to still believe it, and we're all allowed to know it, is that they took their name from the river, and the place took its name from the river. And the word Lowther could either most probably derives from Old Norse, meaning foaming water, or less romantically, it could be early British, and it means a ditch. But let's stick to the first one. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, the 8th century. Yeah. Yeah. Sophie Amber. Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, that would completely tie in with their findings, actually, and yeah, it would. Okay. I'll rewrite my talk for next time. Anyway, so that now we get on to the people and the kind of, you can see the history a little bit more up close because it's closer to us in time. I'm going to try and tell the story more about the place, but interweave it with the people, but talk about the people in terms of their impact on the place. So the first person who really comes into view as a significant human, a person who had effect on Lowther is not Edward III, obviously, but somebody called Sir Hugh de Lowther, who was the third of there were 9 in sequence. And he was Attorney General to the King throughout the kind of 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. The Lowthers' practically full-time job when they weren't going to Parliament was fighting the Scots on behalf of the King, keeping the Scots in Scotland, or at least, I mean, that's true of the borders generally, of course, but anyway, the Lowthers got very involved in that. They were wardens of the West March and captains of Carlisle Castle, and they were always at loggerheads with Scots were always at loggerheads with us. I'm Scots, so I can say that. rather amazing thing on the right is the seal, the right to impart to Warren, in other words, to hunt game over 200 acres of Lowther. In the old days, I thought that that was granted in 1283. I actually was put right by not Charles, but by Sophie Ambler. I'll get you later. It was issued under Edward III in 1337, so it's a bit later than I thought it was. But anyway, that was the beginning of the estate. And I don't know where the 200 acres were, but I presume they're either a part of the park somewhere. And at around the same time, they adopted their arms. That is obviously not a 12th century version, 13th century version of the arms, but the gold is the derivation of why everyone thinks of yellow being associated with Lowther. That derives from the gold. And the 6 amulet sable, the 6 black rings, which may or may not denote the 6 days of creation. I don't know whether that's true or not. But that central shield is, you'll see it in Whitehaven if you look up, you'll see that everywhere. That is the essence of the Lowther arms. The griffin is also part of it, and then the horses, that's later and more fanciful. So Hugh Lowther and his descendants were thought to have moved on from the ringwork castle and to have built a peel tower. That, as most of you will know, is Yanworth Hall, but I just put that there just to give an indication that if you kind of unimagine the right-hand side, that's the sort of thing that they were living in at that time. And obviously that was defensive. So I've skipped a couple of centuries, mostly because there are lots of the Hughes where I said that they were all kind of defending these borderlands against the Scots. A few of them went to Agincourt, and like most English people who went to Agincourt, they came back. But there's not. We don't have any pictures, obviously, of anyone who was there during that time. So this is the first Lowther who we have an idea of their physique and their person. This is Richard Lowther. He was the one who was the captain or the deputy captain of Carlisle Castle when Mary Queen of Scots was in flight from after she'd been defeated at the Battle of Langside. And he was commissioned by Lord Scrope, who was an emissary of Elizabeth, to look after Mary Queen of Scots. So I think he was quite a good egg, Richard. I think he comes across as quite a nice man. He was quite long-lived. He lived till he was 75. He found himself in the Tower of London a couple of times. I haven't quite worked out what he did wrong, but meanwhile, even though he was in the Tower of London, he still managed to, that is a survey of the park, and that shows that the land had increased to 795 acres in 1602. He was still alive then. And if I just skip forward, he had also, so you can see that the left-hand side was the original peel tower that the Hughes probably lived in. And he found time to add the right-hand tower. I'll come back to the central range in a second. Anyway, that was Richard's input. This was Sir John Lowther. These are two, we don't have these in the exhibition, but they are two really remarkable paintings. They both look absolutely terrifying. He's got a gauntlet on. I think he must have been about to fly a bird of prey. And he married Eleanor Fleming. He wrote an autobiography, and he was obviously prone to exaggeration, which I think may be a bit of a family trait, because we'll come on to that in a bit, because he said that the Lowthers went back to the flood, which I don't think is quite true. Anyway, that's just him. And the reason partly that I have him there is because you probably can't see it on that image, but underneath the ogival dome was IEL in 1630. So that was John and Eleanor Lowther, and they were the ones who fancified the middle range. Then we come to some more Johns. The 17th century was John 1, John 2, and John 3, and that's John 2, John 3, John 3, that's John 2. He was the grandfather of that man. That was the first Viscount Lonsdale. He's the one who, he died when he was quite young. He was only 45 when he died. He married Catherine Finn, the Finns of Wilton, very grand family. He went to Parliament. He became a favourite of William, and was therefore made a Viscount. He was the one who he came home from London and from court with his wife, and he found that the house that was there, the one that we've just seen, but 50 years older, 40, 50 years older, was a bit disappointing for his newfound status. So he commissioned William Talman, who was Christopher Wren's protege deputy, to design, although he does say he mostly designed it himself, Lowther Hall. And that is a picture of Lowther Hall done by Kip and Nick, who were the sort of rent-a-mappers of the 17th century. They go around and draw if you've been to Hampton Court, you'll see that there's one of Hampton Court in the gardens painted that's in one of the rooms there. And so Lowther Hall had three sort of big, it doesn't quite portray it quite rightly, or not as it seems in other paintings, but there's the central wing and then two side wings. But and like his grandfather and like his great-great-grandfather, he was quite interested in writing things down, and he wrote a long letter to his son about morality, civility, religion. I can't remember. It was basically quite a long lecture to his son. But one of the salient things that we've all taken from that is that he said, "Shame on any man who who eats at the death of others." In other words, he was a vegetarian. And the gardens on the right, the productive gardens, particularly down close to the house, reflect that interest in having, in growing vegetables, basically. They would have all had productive gardens, but it's notable there. Anyway, he died in 1700, and his son Richard, I don't know how he did it, he had 14 children and he died at age 45. Or maybe I should say, I don't know how she did it. Anyway, Richard was the oldest child, and he was considered to be a star in the making. But he got smallpox and died when he was 21. And his next brother was Henry, who inherited when he was also very young. Henry, I don't think he was a particularly robust figure. He never married. He wasn't particularly interested in Lowther. He had one or two wrong-headed ideas, the most wrong-headed of which was that you didn't need to sweep your chimneys, and there was a fire, and the central wing completely burnt out. That was in 1780. This is a painting by Lady Mary Lowther, who we'll come to in a minute. And she painted this in the 1750s. So in other words, 30 to 40 years after it had been burnt. And you can see that trees are already growing up through the ruin. And Henry he died in 1751, but he just used to live in one of the wings when he preferred Yorkshire though. I think he lost lots of money on the South Sea bubble, and he bred lots of racehorses. And his heir, you probably all know about Wicked Jimmy, James Lowther. So that's an amazing painting that was in the first exhibition that we did. That's by Thomas Hopkins. He was 16 when he inherited, 16 or 17. And that painting is of him in a Harlequin costume going off to some ball or other. You can see the mask there. I feel sure that Thomas Hudson had an inkling that he had a split personality, because he most definitely did have a split personality. I was reading today, so Boswell, the great diarist, tried to get a job through him. Sorry, I'm jumping back. Wicked Jimmy's passions were for political, well, one main passion was for political gerrymandering. He owned 9 pocket boroughs around Appleby, and he just loved. He was always being lampooned in the press for his political dealings. And Boswell tried to. I think Boswell was short of money at the time, and was trying to get a job in Carlisle, and he writes about spending time with Wicked Jimmy. He was an heir to 3 big fortunes: the Whitehaven coal mines. His father was Robert of Moulds-Newton and had inherited quite a lot of money himself through his various marriages. And then Lowther. So when he inherited, he was said to be the richest man in England. And he married Mary Stuart, who was the daughter of Lord Bute, and they were also significant coal. They won in the coal lottery. They also won. That Lady Mary, who painted the ruin of Lowther Hall that we looked at a moment ago, I think she was a really wonderful person. That is a painting that she did of herself painting that painting. And I just love the detail on the dress and everything. It belongs to, it was sold, and it belongs to Yale, I think. Anyway, she couldn't really put up with Wicked Jimmy. I think he was tyrannical. He had a terrible temper. He was incredibly mean. He was foul to the Wordsworth family, as you may or may not know. He wouldn't pay any money. But I think when he died, they found £10,000 worth of gold coins under his bed, and he was mad. Fascinating. He could recite Latin poetry in great depth. He apparently, according to Boswell, he could make a joke, although not very often. Anyway, and in his latter life, he had a mistress called Betsy Lewis, who he met in a pub, and he was said to have kept her in a glass-topped coffin when she died. I'm sure that's another example of some exaggeration, but there we go. But the only contribution that he made to Lowther was that he commissioned lots of different architects to come up with a design for a castle to replace the burnt-out hall. That was one of the designs that the Adams came up with. Thank goodness it wasn't built. But I don't think he even paid any of them. He commissioned Brettingham, who built Holcombe. He commissioned Capability Brown. I think he probably didn't even pay them anyway. But none of them were built. So his impact on Lowther was to make the family notorious, but I don't think he had any impact on it. Oh, he might have dug Decoy Pond, actually. That might be true. Anyway, we come to his heir, William Lowther of Swillington, who was a jolly nice man, I think, to all intents and purposes. That is a painting of him by Thomas Lawrence. He inherited when he was in his 40s. He was married to Augusta Fane. That's her standing in that lovely painting by Fernley, with her groom Pattington. And they had 9 children, I think, and they lived. The first thing he did when he inherited was to commission Robert Snert to build Lowther Castle. He actually commissioned George Dance the younger, but George Dance wasn't that young at that point, and he couldn't face the travel from London to Cumbria, so he gave it to his deputy, his apprentice actually. So that was built from 1806 for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years, something like that, roughly when it was finished. They also had a hunting box in Cottesmore and in Rutland, and he was mad keen on hunting, and he actually used to ride his hounds all the way down to Rutland himself, and then ride them back. And he must have spent all his time in the saddle. But still, he was a benign man. He was a great patron of the arts. He paid the Wordsworth family all the money with interest that Wicked Jimmy hadn't paid them, and therefore got them out of Penrith. He befriended Jacob Thompson, who was a local artist from Penrith, and sent him to the Royal Academy, where he learnt under Thomas Lawrence. They were the other poets, the Subbies and the my mind's gone blank, can't remember who the other poets are. Anyway, they were great. They were great patrons of the arts, and he died when he was quite old. But they had a lovely time. They had loads of money, and they made jokes. And it was then passed on to his son William, who was then the second Earl of Lonsdale, second creation. He was slightly different. He was interesting. He was a great collector. He was the one who built the sculpture galleries, which are added to the castle. He brought this amazing collection of statues, or he compiled rather. I think he bought other people's collections and put them together. Apparently, on his death, on the day he died, when he was 82, he was still going to an auction house to buy more ceramics. He was the one who really topped up the art collection, I think. He also had quite a few mistresses, and he had 3 illegitimate children, all of whom he looked after very well. So I think at the time he was thought to be not a good egg, but I think he's okay. Those are the sculpture galleries as they were, and you can see there's the Cnidian Venus and all sorts of rather grim-looking emperors, but they're all very old and rather wonderful, if you like that sort of thing. And then we come to Henry, and Henry was his nephew, and that's Pussy, his wife. She was Irish, and they had, as it happened, 3 of their sons became Earls of Lonsdale. They didn't do anything to Lowther. He was much more interested in hunting and eating than he was in Lowther. So I don't think they had much impact, but their sons did. So on the left, that's a spy cartoon of St. George. I don't know if anyone's ever made friends on paper with Beatrix Potter, but she was very waspish about St. George when she saw him. She said he was beastly drunk. And she said that he had a harum-scarum reputation. That is the Yellow Earl as a boy. And the inscription said something about he's training his pupils. I'm not going to go into the Yellow Earl in depth because it's such a big story, but that's him as a young man. That's his wife Gracie. There are a few things I'm going to mention, however. You probably all know about the Yellow Earl, and you may or may not have an opinion on him. I think there were all sorts of different aspects to him that were interesting and some that were not. Your dad wrote something very sweet in the Yellow Earl preface about going to tea at Lowther when they were children. I don't know if you've read that. And how he used to, I think he giggled like a child. I think he was a sweet old man, and he always used to give them half a crown after they'd had tea. And in my mind, I had him built up as this ridiculous, pompous old bull, but actually, I think he's probably both. He had many unusual and rather extreme abilities. His ability with animals, his ability as a sort of animal whisperer. He was a phenomenal horseman, and that, although he exaggerated hugely about what he did achieve, I still think he was a great horseman. He also he loved boxing, and he said that he knocked out John L. Sullivan, who was a great American boxer, or the great boxer of his generation. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But one of the things that he was incredibly good at was self-promotion. And he had an affair with an actress called Violet Cameron when he was fairly early on in his marriage. Violet Cameron was married to a Moroccan tea planter called Monsieur de Bonsaud, and Monsieur de Bonsaud didn't take very kindly to the fact that Lord Lonsdale was having an affair with his wife, indeed having a child with his wife. But Lord Lonsdale was sponsoring their theatre company, so it was all a bit of a perfect storm. I think they took the theatre troupe to America, and somebody biffed somebody, and somebody went to court, and it all got back to Queen Victoria, who was unamused and suggested that he left the country. And he hooked himself up on this Arctic expedition, and which went on for about a year, and that's him in full, I don't know what they are, seal skins and woolly mammoths, whatever they are. And he came back from that. His physical stamina was remarkable. I don't know that many people died on the expedition, but it was still quite a thing. And B, he came back a celebrity because he I don't know, he'd sent dispatches back, and so by the time he returned home, he was a sort of conquering hero. And that is his Billy McLean, who was his man on the tour, and those are three of the huskies that they brought back, and that's outside on the south side of the castle. And in terms of boxing, with the Marquis of Queensberry, they were formed bare knuckle fighting, and I mean, he commissioned the Lonsdale belt. Of course, it cost an absolute fortune. He commissioned it from Garrard. That's Freddie Welsh, who was the first winner of the first Lonsdale belt. But that, you know, he can rightfully be remembered for that. But in terms of investment in the castle, he did not, and you can just tell. You don't even need to explain that photo for you to realise that he spent money like water. That photograph on the right, I included it just because I don't know if any of you used to know the garage in Penrith called Kieser, K-I-E-S-E-R. That man there is Kieser, and he was a chauffeur who was given to the LOL by the Kaiser, who was his friend, and they stayed, and they had a garage in Penrith until, I don't know, relatively recently. I think it folded within the last 20 years. And I think that might be the car that the Kaiser gave him as well. Anyway, he fancified Lowther cosmetically, but he didn't invest in it. And eventually his trustees got absolutely fed up with him because he'd spent his money, and he had to leave in 1936. And that's what happens when you spend all the money. So this is a photograph taken in 1939. It's one of the earliest aerial photographs taken by a man called Christopher Wood. And you can't really, I don't think I can zoom in on this thing, but if you look very closely, whilst the house has roofs and windows and things, it actually is empty and sad. But yes, there's an omnibus there, but you can see the shadows of the parterres. It's basically an empty house. While I've got that photograph there, that right-hand wing, which is the west wing, you can see that those buildings on the very right belong to the original Lowther Hall, very different architectural stamp altogether. Anyway, that's Lowther just before the war, standing empty, probably full of dry rot. Some stuff in it, some stuff gone, because nobody really doing anything with it. That's Lowther from 1942 to 1945, when it was occupied by the army and they were experimenting with the canal defence light. The army didn't inhabit the castle per se, but they used some of the rooms for lectures and things. They covered the gardens in concrete with the tanks. The canal defence light was a gazillion horsepower Campbell power light mounted on the top of the turrets of Matilda and Victoria. Because, by the way, if there are any tank nuts in the audience, I apologise because I'm probably getting all the facts a bit wrong. Anyway, the idea was that this blinding light would blind the enemy, and I don't think it was really deployed during the Second World War, not least because it was such a secret operation that nobody knew about it. But this did not help Lowther in its general state. So this is Lancelot and his wife at the grave of the Yellow Earl when he died in 1944. As you can see from his stance, Lancelot was no spring chicken when he inherited. And at that time, 1944, the end of the war, or coming to the end of the war, the whole of Britain was absolutely on its knees. He didn't know what to do with Lowther Castle. It was empty and, in a terrible state. So he instigated this enormous sale, and there were 7,800 lots from Titians to pots and pans that were sold, all for pennies. And then James Lonsdale, who was Lancelot's nephew, is that right? Grandson, beg your pardon. He inherited in 1953, Lancelot died in 1953. That rather blurry photograph from the Herald shows you some of the old carriages and gigs out in front of the south side of the castle, presumably for that sale in 1947. And you can see the concrete that's been left by the army and the general state of dishevelment of the house. Anyway, James inherited, he had been in the war, he'd been in the Normandy landings. He was like many men of his generation. I don't think he was that chuffed that the previous generation had got them into the war in the first place. I don't think particularly approved of the extravagance of the Yellow Earl. He decided, I think, that rather than rescue the castle, which in 1950s nobody had any money, everything was sad and broken, he'd rather knock down the castle and focus on salvaging the estate. These are various kind of documents showing that he discussed knocking it down altogether, but in the end he compromised and just took it down to a single skin of stone and removed the roof. And that was Thomas Oakley who they dealt with the demolition sale. And then he set to trying to kind of commercialise the grounds as much as possible. They started with saddlebacks. I don't think that lasted very long, but it's a great photo. Then commercial spruce crops were planted right up to the house, and you can see this the beginning, just at the very top of that photo, you can see a chicken shed. And then again, you can see the spruce crop growing, the chicken shed more established, all basically commercialising what had been pleasure grounds. That's it a few years on. That's the courtyard, where people go in now, and that was basically used as a sort of farm stall. That also tells its own story. And then we come to, and that went on until, this is a man from English Heritage in 1999 who came along. It was their first, they created the Buildings at Risk Register, and this is him coming it's, well, obviously they've been before, but they put Lowther on as a, I think it was 1 star or something. It was very bad and very, very bad or something. Anyway, they recognised that it was going to fall down if nobody did anything about it. James Lonsdale wasn't that keen on doing anything about it, so it had to wait a moment or two. He died in 2006. There'd been some machinations towards doing some big studies and getting some funding to stabilise some of the bits that were falling down and making it safe, basically. But it wasn't until James Lonsdale died that this sort of operation could begin. And the spruce, Jim Lowther, started to clear the spruce. He had set up a charity called Lowther Castle and Gardens Trust with Brian Gray, and they set about raising lots of money, knocking down chicken sheds, trying to rescue an all-round bad dog, removing millions of tons of, well, probably not millions of tons, but thousands of tons of concrete, which the army had left, which then went to make tracks around the estate. I'm rushing through this bit just because it's a big story all on its own, and I've been going on for too long. But this just gives you an inkling of the amount of work that's gone into the rebirth of Lowther. That's Dan Pearson, he suggested, he was invited by the charity to come along and take on the design of the gardens, and he suggested this place in Italy called Nympha. I don't know if anyone's been there, but that was a kind of ruined, I think it's actually a village, and that's not a very nice photograph, but it gives you an idea of how you could do something with a ruin. And so Dan wrote the 20-year master plan, and that's still being followed. This gives you an idea of the amount of work and detail that has gone into this trying to stop the thing falling down. Each of those merlons being taken down, counted, numbered, mended, replaced. There were loads of challenges along the way, but and then in May 2012 it opened to the public. I think that apparently the catering offer for the first few months when it was opened was you could go into the bungalow and there was a little sign next to the kettle saying "Help yourself." So, and then this is the result of all those efforts. The one thing that has just recently changed in that photograph, apart from the fact that the gardens have consolidated a lot, is that the pinnacle, which is the bit between those two pointy things above the window, sorry, technical detail, has been completed, which was kind of a real milestone. It's still not, the whole room is still not consolidated, but it probably will be completed at the end of next year. And now it's been open to the public for 13 years, and there's the pinnacle completed. That was just done the other day. So that's the gallop. There was just one thing I wanted to say at the end, which was about the Lowther Way. We called it the Lowther Way as a play on the path, and I was trying to think if I could sort of pull it together in terms of a word. Is there a word for the Lowther Way, either the people or the place? And I suppose you could say bumpy. But I looked up what 3 words. I don't know if anyone uses what 3 words. And depending on where you put your cursor on the square over Lowther Castle and Gardens, the first one was nappy apple heartache, which I didn't really think said much. And then trespass decays sensibly, and that's kind of a bit closer. But the third one was fallen battle profited, which I think if you put the square just over the A of Lowther Castle, you get that. So I think that's the Lowther way. Anyway.
Wow.
Can I say one more thing about the Lake District Book Festival? If any of you are literary, please come to the Lake District Book Festival next year. I'm doing it with Christopher de Belay is the director, and I'm putting the thing together. And it's going to be 3 days at Cartmel Racecourse every year from next year, and it's going to be a big thing. So do follow it, and that would be great. Thank you.
Should we have some more light? Very good. Wow, what a treasure trove of information, knowledge, the walking encyclopedia. It's extraordinary, isn't it? I don't know how you can summarize what I do know how you've done it. 1,000 years of history into less than an hour is a pretty amazing achievement.
Well, I definitely skipped out quite a few pages, but...
Can I open the floor to people who would like to ask any questions? Or Zoomers as well. We always try to include the Zoomers in this exercise.
No, I did look into it, and I did find out. I think it was actually something that Wicked Jimmy came by, and that it ended up, and that then the first William I, Lord Lonsdale, blah blah, inherited it and gave it to Appleby. I think that's what happened, and it was through this man called he had some connection with Wicked Jimmy. I can't remember what it was actually, but it was quite interesting because Sophie Ambler, who I mentioned before, she went fossicking in the archive to help those two academics who were, one of them was from Norfolk and one of them was from London, I think, and they just twigged that the Harvard, I'm going into this, but I don't know if you know, if anybody heard this story, that it turns out that there was a copy of the Magna Carta which nobody knew it still existed, and they found it at Harvard, and Harvard had had it. They bought it for somebody had bought it for £25 in 1940 or something, and given it to Harvard, and their cataloguing system hadn't. It just had a number of letters and numbers. They didn't know what they had. And these two academics sort of thought, oh, that's funny, that looks like something. And they found out that it was the Magna Carta and it had connections with Lowther. But the connections are a bit tenuous, I think. But I don't know, Sophie Ambler's the person who'd be able to tell you more. In fact, they may have had it now, but they were doing a talk in Appleby about it. They were doing a free event for the people of Appleby to discuss it. But I mean, amazing. Never mind going back to the slides.
Peter.
Yeah, sure. So I think it was Henry, the one who let the house burn down, who appointed Richard Wordsworth as his agent, and I think I said that he didn't live there very much. And then it segued into Richard's son John became Wicked Jimmy's political agent, and Wicked Jimmy being a miser and avaricious beyond imagining, and the wealthiest man, on the planet. They didn't get paid, and I think they were living in Cockermouth at the time. And when Wicked Jimmy died, William Lonsdale put an advert in the Cumberland Packet saying all people who believe they're owed money by the estate, please apply. And as part of that movement, I mean, I don't think the Wordsworth answered a newspaper ad, but because they knew perfectly well who the money should have been from, but he then paid back. So they'd spent a lot of money on legal fees trying to win. It was just his wage, but he wouldn't pay it. He was such a peculiar person. And so William Lonsdale paid the legal fees with interest, and also gave William Wordsworth a job. He was the recorder of stamps or something. So yeah, so kind of good and bad. And William Wordsworth wrote 2, 3, 4 poems about Lowther. He loved Lord Lonsdale and Augusta, I think. That mixed relationship.
I'm trying to think of the comparison between a visit that my wife and I made to Alnwick Castle yesterday, and the Percy family, and it's just packed with goodies of one sort. It's completely rehabilitated. There's swords on the walls and huge plush and vases everywhere and mice and the rest. And you compare that with the bare skeleton, the sort of the bones of Lowther, and how the Percy family or the successors seem to have celebrated their wealth and they're keeping it going. And then the Lowther family seem to have taken a different route. Both have a long history of importance, if you like, in British history. I'm just wondering where you haven't really talked about the vision, the Lowther vision of restoration. Obviously, you haven't touched on beavers and woodland and rewilding, and I don't know what. Yeah.
I mean, the restoration of the castle
is a huge thing. Yeah.
And the estate talk is one that it shouldn't be me who gets that. It should be Lee Schofield, probably.
Right.
Who he's got, he understands that, and he is doing it. I don't think the vision was ever to put the roof back on the castle. I think that would have been just hellish. I don't think it would have been very nice inside anyway. It was big and dark.
And it's just for me the contrast between one route, which is the celebration of wealth and all that, and the celebration of the regrowth, literally the rebirth of Phoenix rising from the ashes in different, with a courtyard and a Japanese garden and a playground for kids, one of the biggest tourist resorts in the Cairn Town. It's a different.
In the 1950s, though, and I'm sure that you know this, but there was a period during the 1950s when 2 or 3 big houses, stately houses, were being knocked down a week, and they weren't, Lowther was saved, really. I mean, it was, you can say it was destroyed, but it was an act of salvation for the estate, and I don't know that you would have, I don't know, what would you do with it if it did have a roof?
I'm just trying to think what the vision, what is articulated, if you like, in vision. Of course, the exhibition is a magnificent summary, if you like, of the various things that you've touched on here, the actual people. Where you're looking in 20 years, so what do you want Lowther to look like in 30 years?
Majestic pile.
Sorry, I don't know. We haven't met. So. Okay.
I've just been listening to Can You Forgive Her by Trollope, read by Timothy West. I can't recommend it more highly. And there's somebody called Lord Vavasor who lives at Vavasor Hall, which is somewhere very close to Lowther. And there's a particular walk where they go on the beacon, Alice Vavasor and her cousin. It's really, they talk about chaps And I mean, Trollope. I have a great story about Trollope and Wordsworth, actually. I don't know if anyone here knew David Crackenthorpe, who died this year, but he was a local writer and a great character. And the Crackenthorpes have been in Cumbria for, I think 22 generations. And Mrs. Trollope bought a house outside Penrith when Anthony Trollope was working for the post office, I think. And David Crackenthorpe's ancestor was a friend of Mrs. Trollope, or met Mrs. Trollope, and apparently Mrs. Trollope had just had the poet to stay or to tea, and David Crackenthorpe's ancestor asked Mrs. Trollope what he spoke about, and she said, himself.
So, if there are no more questions, can I thank you once again for your fantastic, really, really exciting, tracing the roots, the family roots through such a long time, and your positivism and enthusiasm and so on shines through. I think it's great, and your creativity as well. When I first was asking you what sort of image would you like for the poster, and you sent back a picture of the red castle. I don't know, crikey! If you look at this, you know, it's on flames. Is this a sort of death wish almost?
That's a paper model of the house with the two field towers.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, it's beautiful. It's really nice.
Was in the first exhibition. Well, it's in both exhibitions actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you very much indeed. I've got to ask you, as you know, it's a tradition here. We try and raise money for local charities and so on. Do you have a particular charity you want to?
I'm going to nominate the James's Place charity, which is the one that Lowther supports, which helps young men in suicidal crisis.
So we'll be rattling the basket for your contributions and for Zoomers as well. And there's a donation link. So I'll send out the link to the charity as well. So, yeah. And let me just say just a final thing. The next talk is going to be given by Dr. Michael Thornley, who is a founder of the Thornley Wildlife Trust, and he's going to talk about ospreys. His most is as you know, it's one of these iconic birds, and he's been heavily involved. Maybe you know him I don't know, in conservation of ospreys over the years. So he's going to come, and that is on the 2nd of October, and it's going to take place in Watermillock Ridge Hall. So thank you again for your contribution. And